Okay, welcome to the final module, Module 7, in which we'll be discussing South Asia. I'm going to begin with the physical geography of the region, then we'll talk particularly about population, and then the question of development, poverty, and globalization. So let's begin with kind of looking at the region, and a couple of very important ideas to see physically in it. We'll return to these in some detail in a minute. But again, what I want you to understand is this area right here, and this is kind of the backbone of the region. This is the Himalayan as well as the Kashmir regions of South Asia, and really that border provides the physical barrier between South Asia, Southwest Asia, and East and Southeast Asia. And what we'll see later on is that that barrier is incredibly important both in terms of culture, climate, and the development of the region. Below that, what you can see wonderfully in this slide, are these riverine lowlands, the riverine valleys that exist within South Asia. And what we'll see later again is how we can divide these into, I've changed to a nice blue line here, the Ganges or Ganga system, which runs this way, the Brahmaputra, which runs this way, and then the Indus, which runs this way. And so we really have these three incredibly important systems that define the lower areas. Now, as we move south, then we move into the plateau regions, the eastern western Ghats, of course, and the Deccan Plateau. What is also important to note is the island aspects of South Asia. Most notably, we're going to be talking about Sri Lanka. Okay, some important ideas to put in place. South Asia, the second most populous region in the world. India with well over 1.2 billion people. It is absolutely a distinct landmass. We often talk about the Indian subcontinent because of this incredibly significant barrier in terms of the mountain orogenies. We are interested in them from the standpoint of relatively few countries. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Bhutan, Sri Lanka, and the Maldives. Again, if we think about this, we have really three mainland features here, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh. We have two mountain states, Nepal and Bhutan, and then two island states, Sri Lanka and the Maldives. And so we want to think about is how that kind of divides the region up and then how it brings it together. As you read the chapter, one of the things that often comes into play when talking about South Asia is the challenge of poverty. And this text, like many others, really emphasizes images that show the extreme poverty of the region. But you have to be careful with that concept because when you look at many of the urban centers, while there is extreme poverty, South Asia also has areas of extreme wealth. And so it is the disparity that is often a significant issue. Now, in terms of the environmental issues associated with South Asia, the ones from the text that you really want to pay attention to are the questions of climate, environmental challenges primarily associated with human pressures on natural ecosystems, most notably forest and deforestation, populations moving into areas that are perhaps not as hospitable as people should be occupying, for example, the Bangladeshi, the Ganges Delta region, and then, of course, the earthquake-prone nature of the foothills of the Himalayas and into the Hindu Kush and the Kashmir region. And all of these are challenging to the human population within the region. Now, again, when you put these together, think about how climate and changing climate has such a great potential on this region. While it is incredibly densely populated, people are still remarkably agricultural. And in that respect, we have to really be aware of how climate and climate change could intensify or shift the patterns of precipitation and aridity. Now, as you read the text, please pay attention to the monsoonal system. Monsoonal system is really fairly simple to understand. Monsoons are a rain system, fairly narrow in terms of time. It typically occupies 1 to 3 months. And what you will notice is that it is a system that is driven by the movements of high and low pressure systems. The low pressure systems, essentially occurring, and what you'll notice in the first half of the slide, is that the low pressure systems that exist here, and then relatively speaking on the Indian subcontinent's landmass, as India heats in the summer, and I mean this as the whole subcontinental region, as it heats in the summer, air rising off of this area pulls relatively moist air from the Indian Ocean onto land. Again, this low pressure system over land pulling air into the area. As it does so, it comes up against the backdrop of the Himalaya mountains as well as the Hindu Kush and into the Kashmir. And as it hits that backdrop, it rises, the air cools, and we get this dramatic precipitation events along the Bangladesh Delta region. And you can see that when it's just this dramatic movement of air up against that backdrop, as well as into the Ganges plain here. Now, what happens in the winter months is that because the temperature in the Tibetan plateau gets very, very, very cold, it produces a continental high pressure region. And high pressure is air that's descending and then flowing outward. So in the winter months, this high pressure up to the north and east actually causes air to move downward and from a very arid Tibetan interior across the Indian subcontinent, and essentially there is no chance for precipitation. So when we talk about the monsoonal system, it's really a system that absolutely shuts the door on precipitation in the winter and drives immense amounts of precipitation during a very narrow summer belt. And again, we can see this when we think about the kind of the climatic landscape of the region. What is so interesting is that Bangladesh is, and you'll notice it right here, this climatograph that shows this immense precipitation event occurring. And we also see that here along the Western Ghats region, and then to a degree into kind of the southeastern portion of the Ganges Delta. The rest of India is dominated by either continental, wet climates, or tropical climates and subtropical climates that receive a fairly high amount of precipitation. In contrast, the main point that I want you to note is that all of this, everything that is essentially India, with the exception of the interior desert here, India and Bangladesh receive more than enough moisture throughout the year to produce significant amounts of agriculture. In contrast, when we look at Pakistan, Pakistan essentially has a climate that is semi-arid. And that semi-arid climate does lead to the production of cereal grains, primarily wheat, but it is a much, much more difficult climate to produce agriculture in. And so, very dramatic divide east to west in the Indian subcontinent. West Pakistan has very, very little precipitation and really relies on the Indus for its irrigation, whereas much of eastern South Asia gets more than enough precipitation in the form of monsoons or heavy seasonal precipitation. As you read the text again, make sure that you are comfortable with the four major regions as they are defined in the text. All right, so now we're going to move into the question of population within the region. And what we have to again remember is that South Asia is the second most populous region in the world, and India the second most populous country. Some could argue that it may at this point be the most populous country. All right, so as I said, the critical issue in much of South Asia is the question of population and population density. So as you look at this map and as you read the chapter on population, consider where the population is concentrated, population density versus absolute population in terms of Bangladesh versus India, and then the question of resources and the changing aspects of total fertility within the population. When we look at the overall indicators, the other point that I do want to make is the question of population and poverty. As you read the text, you'll note that when they talk about India, India has more undernourished children than any other country in the world, and it also has more people living on under $2 a day, both of which are strong indicators of poverty or absolute poverty. However, what is interesting is that in all of the countries of the region, the percent of the population that is moving into the middle class is increasing. The other thing that we also will see is that within the population, there is a beginning movement towards urbanization and towards educational levels and a drop in total fertility. And so all of these things are coming together. So as you read the chapter, consider the linkages between absolute poverty, population change, and then economic development. Now, what I do want you to pay attention to also is which countries are succeeding and which are succeeding most in terms of controlling their populations. It is clear that populations in excess of 1 billion people are not sustainable in the region, nor is the population of over 250 million people in the relatively small country of Pakistan sustainable. And so the question becomes, what are the countries doing? What are their strategies to change their population growth rates, and where is it succeeding? And one of the ones that is clearly held up is the strategies the positive strategies that have been adopted in Bangladesh and the success they have had. In general, what I want you to remember is that changes in population growth rates are generally linked to opportunity. Rather draconian strategies used in China, while they are successful in the short term, are difficult to maintain over the long term. And so most scholars today believe that increasing opportunities for women, increasing education, and increasing the overall opportunities for integration into the economy are the best strategies for reducing population growth. What I also want you to note as you read through is the challenge of urbanization in South Asia. You will come across a number of discussions in the text of the challenges of the urban cities, especially Mumbai and Kolkata, in terms of the rapid population growth and the lack of housing and basic sanitary resources for the populations. As a result, you'll notice that the hutment prospects, that is, people living in temporary dwellings on sidewalks or in streets, has become a devastating challenge to these urban centers. So as you read that, consider what that might be like. What we also have to address when we look at South Asia is its strategies of feeding itself. As a relatively small region, and a region that is challenged by a very uneven climatic characteristic, the development of food and the production of food is a challenge. Absolute population pressure limits the availability of land resources. And so in South Asia, they have been extremely aggressive in developing agricultural technologies, what we call today the Green Revolution. However, the applications of modern agricultural technologies have not been without cost, most notably in terms of the cost per unit of land used, the continuing use of things such as fertilizers, chemical pesticides, and heavy machinery. All these things are a challenge to food production in the region. All right. If we then look at the urban areas and the agricultural areas, as you move through the text, make sure that you think about what these challenges are and what the consequences of continued rapid growth will be. A recent study came out that put air quality in Mumbai, in fact, worse than that of Beijing, which was historically considered the worst air quality in a modern city. And what South Asia is facing is increasing challenges in terms of environmental quality within its urban centers, not to mention the challenge of a lack of infrastructure and political and ethnic tensions that increase as you increase the in-movement to the urban centers. Make sure you pay attention to the challenges in Mumbai, how they differ from those in Karachi, and why these countries are challenged and yet need to grow their urban centers. All right, let's bring together a little bit of the cultural challenges and the cultural history of the South Asian region. First of all, historically, all of the region would have been considered effectively Hindu. Prior to the advent of Islam, the development of Islam in the 7th century, all of the Indian subcontinent would have been dominated by Hindu ethnic groups, with the exception of the two areas, two mountain states, Nepal and Bhutan, which had a Buddhist traditions in them. But with the advent of Islam, during the 12th through 14th century, the movement of Islam into the region, and ultimately the development by the 16th century of the Mughal empires, what we saw was the development of two religious cultures that, in fact, until British occupation, really worked quite well together. Once the British came in the 1750s and came to kind of the apex at the turn of the 20th century, we begin to see a little bit of a change in terms of how these two religious groups interacted. As we move forward into partition, the question of a Hindu state versus a Muslim state really raised the tension level. Today, Hindu nationalism, Islamic fundamentalism, and minority populations such as the Sikh population continue to cause challenges within the region. Today we can really see the geography of religion as the landscape of conflict to a large degree in the region. It's hard not to accept that as a significant underpinning to conflict. You'll notice the strong division India to Pakistan in terms of Hindu versus Muslim populations. You can see the same thing in terms of Bangladesh. Remember, Bangladesh formerly was East Pakistan. And then in Sri Lanka, most notably, you can see the divide between the Tamil Tigers, the Hindu Tamil Tigers in the north, the Tamil population, and a separatist movement, and then the Buddhist population in the south. And throughout the early part of 2000 through 2010, that conflict remained very, very significant. Don't forget about the other religions, though, that are present, most notably, again, the Sikh population. And what makes the Sikh population so interesting is it as a syncretism. Remember that as syncretic religions are those that are combinations. And in this case, it is a syncretic religion formed out of characteristics of both Hinduism and Islam. Linguistically, the interesting challenge is that throughout the region, English is still a very, very important language, but in the rest of kind of the linguistic geographies, what we see are diverse language families, both Dravidian, Indo-Aryan language groups, as well as Asiatic language groups, all coming together in the region and producing a very complex second language or indigenous language landscape. Again, think about that, but think about how, and many of you have probably experienced this, how having English-speaking populations allowed for the globalization of call centers within the region. Bangladesh, India, and Pakistan all serve as very effective low-cost labor centers for call centers, that is international customer service. We can also think about South Asia as a region that is out-migrating to in a large extent to much of the rest of the world. And the global Asian diaspora continues to be an interesting challenge to the region and to the rest of the world. Because India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh have a relatively well-educated and English-speaking population, a large portion of their population continues to outmigrate to the United States, Canada, and to Great Britain. And in all of these countries, we see ethnic neighborhoods and ethnic regions developing that begin to have strong Indian, Pakistani, and Bangladeshi cultural characteristics. In fact, many people argue that the best place to get Indian food in the world is in London, not in fact in India. And so we can see that these movements, and in the United States, in Chicago, in New York, in Los Angeles, you have little Indias that develop and have incredibly powerful connections to the South Asian continent. Now, today, the region remains an area of extremely tense geopolitical conflict. And what we think about today, of course, is the Pakistani Indian hot zone, and we really have to consider it a hot zone for a number of reasons. First of all, because of the contested landscapes of the Kashmir in the north, both India and Pakistan laying claims to areas and having significant troop populations in that area. The other thing that we do have to be aware of in the region is that both India and Pakistan are nuclear powers. This is one of the most difficult militarized zones, and unfortunately many scholars also think in this area this is one of the areas that is most likely to turn into a regional nuclear conflict, much more likely anymore than what would have been thought during the Cold War. Of course, in addition, we have challenges along the Nepalese-Chinese border, the continuing unrest in Sri Lanka related to the now defunct Tamil Tigers, but the Tamil population remains very, very unhappy about the political landscape of Sri Lanka. And then, of course, the other separatist and ethnic movements within India proper. All of this, ultimately, we can associate with the idea of partition. I'm not going to go into that now, but as you read that, please pay attention to the map that I have here and how the transformation from the Mughal Empire to the British colonialism, finally to independence and partition, associates with what is happening in the region today. Focus on the Kashmir. As I said here, your text does actually have a very interesting image of the Indian soldier looking down into the Pakistani segment of the Kashmir. And so this area remains one of those places in the world today where two countries are in fact periodically actively shooting at each other. Finally, spend some time on the question of poverty. It's not often in this class that I ask you to specifically look at the development indicators, but I think it's worth comparing the GDP values in this region to those of North America or of Europe, and seeing how far down many of these countries are in terms of their population and their ability to provide economic development. Now, what we can end on then is that in South Asia there is both incredible poverty, and again there are the numbers, as I mentioned earlier and are mentioned in the texts, are sometimes very disheartening. 2/3 of the people in India live on less than $2 a day. Well, think about that. It's a country of 1.2 billion people. 2/3 of that living on less than $2 a day. That's poverty at a truly catastrophic level. At the same time, they are truly growing a middle class, and in that middle class there is rather robust economic development. And so that is the tension that India especially faces, although Pakistan and Bangladesh have similar challenges, where there is extreme poverty and yet there is a great deal of potential within the middle class. Where the development is occurring is primarily, again, in technology, although in entertainment as well. Certainly the film industry, the largest in the world, is Bollywood. The Silicon Plateau, incredibly robust development of internet and high-tech technologies. And so these things represent the possibilities for South Asia. They also represent the challenges in terms of how widespread can the benefits from this development become. Okay, finally, there are also the challenges of what South Asia may become in the future. One of the ways that South Asia is also moving is into manufacturing, especially heavy manufacturing, and interestingly enough, into automobile manufacturing. And so, in the future, there are a number of different directions that South Asia may move towards that may change its place in the world. So, with that, we'll end this section and the end of the class for the semester. Again, if you have any questions about the final projects, please contact me via email. Again, thanks for having me.